In 1978, there was a video game industry, but not a video game media dominance. Pong had introduced the world to the concept of gaming, and reaped its just rewards for it, but the world hadn't moved much beyond that. Not until a Japanese company called Taito released an unassuming space game that proceeded to truly take the world by storm. I'm Lord Thoralis, and welcome to Space Invaders in about 9 minutes. To properly understand why Space Invaders was such an incredible success, we first have to look at the state of the video game industry in the later 1970s, and how it ended up in that situation. Pong's release in 1972 had kicked an entirely new industry into being, but by 6 years later, the industry had started to stagnate. Businesses from across the globe had seen Pong's dramatic entry, and had rushed to try and see if they too could capture that lightning in a bottle. The problem was, their methods of doing so weren't exactly original. Barely a few years after Pong's release, the market was flooded with minor variations, shoddy rip-offs, and even outright copies of Atari's work. Nor were Atari themselves really racing ahead with originality. They were producing a variety of different arcade games, but nearly all of them were still based upon their original bouncing ball idea. Probably the most successful of them was 1976's Breakout, and that's pretty much just single-player Pong with levels. The novelty of that gameplay was also starting to wear off. Pong had been an amazing seminal feat when it first launched, its simplicity allowing it to be picked up and played by anyone. By 6 years later though, that simplicity had become derivative. Pong was too simple to be enjoyed regularly, and it no longer had the shine of the brand new technology to support that. The market was ripe for a shake-up, something new to revitalise it. Enter Taito, a Japanese company that made, among other things, arcade games both physical and video. And more importantly to this, a Taito employee named Tomohiro Nishikado, the man behind the entirety of Space Invaders' development. Space Invaders has humble origins. Nishikado cites a number of different sources as inspiring him to create what was originally called Space Monsters, but then changed at the orders of Nishikado's superiors. Now, despite what I said previously, the core gameplay concept of Space Invaders isn't actually 100% original. According to Nishikado himself, the base idea of the game was originally taken from Breakout. Nishikado wanted to capture that sense of satisfaction and achievement from destroying all the targets and completing stages, but move forward from the simplistic black and white line art that characterised graphics at the time. But what made Space Invaders so very unique compared to its peers wasn't necessarily the basic gameplay loop, but the implementation of it, and the various groundbreaking for the time innovations that came with it. Foremost among these is an idea that would come to define nearly the entire gaming world since: the difficulty curve. It's somewhat strange for modern audiences to think about the idea of a game that doesn't get more challenging in some way as you play through it. But for early video games, the difficulty curve wasn't really a concept. Many of these games weren't single player, so the difficulty of the game was entirely tied to the skill of your opponents. Even those rare single-person games that did exist didn't really get much harder as you played them. Breakout in its original form is just the same level over and over again, measured primarily by how many blocks you can take out in the time limit. Space Invaders' idea that the game became harder the better the player did was completely new to the industry, and the best part about it is that it exists entirely by accident. Whilst we can't be 100% certain, it's likely that the original gameplay of Space Invaders was envisioned as a sort of moving Breakout, challenging players to get rid of all the ships on the screen before they reach the bottom, slowly descending at a steady pace. However, Space Invaders was a complex game. So complex, in fact, that it was more powerful than the microcomputers available in Japan at the time. Without access to a supercomputer, for obvious reasons, Nishikado had to design his own custom-built hardware and development tools using the latest technology from the United States. Even that proved barely enough to get the game running. The strain of the cutting-edge programming meant that the sprites moved across the screen at a tortuous pace when you started the level, far too slowly for gameplay to be enjoyable. However, as he tested the game, Nishikado realised that as he destroyed ships, thereby removing their images from the screen, it freed up the overtaxed resources of the system. For every ship destroyed, the rest moved faster. Nishikado realised this created a highly engaging and challenging form of gameplay. Could you get that one last ship as it raced across the screen to your doom? So he decided to keep the feature, and the rest of the game was to a degree made around it. Which leads us to the second feature that helped make Space Invaders such a groundbreaking game: its design. Space Invaders pushed the bitmap-focused graphics of the time to their limit. Every single ship had their own individual animation, and there were multiple different types of ship on screen at once. It's a big contributor to why it taxed the computer so much. Those graphics made clear as day just how simplistic and basic their predecessors were, and they brought with them another big innovation: colour. Sort of. Early versions of Space Invaders had colours on the screen, but they weren't generated through coloured pixels. Instead, layers of coloured plastic were placed across certain parts of the screen, which created the image of colour for pixels on that level. Later versions of Space Invaders would be created with full electronic colour though. Space Invaders is emphatically not the first colour video game. Exactly what is a subject of some debate, but it can certainly be credited with bringing gameplay in colour to the widespread gaming audience. Yet whilst its graphics were certainly impressive, the truly seminal part of Space Invaders' design, at least in my opinion, was its sound. Effective sound design wasn't an innovation in the industry. Pong's simple yet communicative sound design had made utilising your sound effectively a big part of developing games since their inception. But before Space Invaders, games had effects, but they never properly had sound. The closest they'd gotten to a proper sound suite was brief introductory jingles and game over noises. But with Space Invaders, you had sound that was constant, punctuating the gameplay, and most importantly, reacting to your actions. The music in Space Invaders isn't a static repeating tune. It speeds up as the ships do. What starts off as a simple 4-tone beat reaches a frenetic, tension-inducing drum as you frantically chase that last ship racing from side to side. It creates a mood, an environment to playing the game, on top of providing a clear message to any onlookers as to exactly how well you're doing. I'm a big proponent of the value of sound design in video games, and Space Invaders is, in my eyes at least, a fantastic example of how to do it right. Much like Pong before it, Space Invaders was a pretty instant hit. All of its various attributes combined to make a new, different experience, with themes, settings and gameplay unlike anything that had come before it. After a launch in June, by the end of 1978, Space Invaders had grossed over $600 million from Japan alone. There were even arcades opened with nothing but Space Invaders machines in them. By the time the arcade industry reached its height in 1982, Space Invaders had grossed $3.8 billion. That's over $10 billion in 2020's money. Pong might have created an industry, but it was Space Invaders that created the phenomenon of gaming. And that is Space Invaders in a nutshell. An earth-shattering success that we still know and love today. Now, it's worth mentioning that whether that success was purely down to the innovative gameplay and unique additions is a conversation for a far longer video than mine. There's definitely a potential argument to be made that Space Invaders was just the first game over the line. If it hadn't been Space Invaders, there would have been another game with sufficiently unique mechanics released in that time period that would have exploded to the same level. But my time is up, so I'll simply leave you with this to think about until next time. Which would be scarier? Space Invaders with the Jaws theme, or Jaws with the Space Invaders theme? Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you next time.